Good evening, everyone. My name is Meredith Toohey, and I'm the Director of Programmatic Operations at the American Nutrition Association, the ANA. The ANA is very pleased to be hosting Dr. Deanna Minich today to discuss eating the spectrum of phytochemicals for whole body wellness. Dr. Deanna Minich is a nutrition researcher, educator, and functional medicine trained clinician with a unique approach to nutrition that combines physiology and psychology. She has served on the Institute of Functional Medicine's Nutrition Advisory Board and Curriculum Committee, in addition to being a faculty member teaching nutrition for the Advanced Practice Module for Environmental Health. She currently serves on the board of directors for the American Nutrition Association. Her academic background is in nutritional science, including a master's degree in human nutrition and dietetics from the University of Illinois at Chicago, and a PhD in medical sciences nutrition from the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. In conjunction with her academic degrees and extensive teaching experience at the university level, she is a fellow of the American College of Nutrition and a certified nutrition specialist. She is an author of 6 books on nutrition, wellness, and psychology, and is passionate in helping others to live well using therapeutic lifestyle changes. Visit her at www.deannaminich.com. Welcome, Dr. Minich.
Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Deanna Minich, and I'm here to talk with you about the spectrum of phytonutrients for whole body wellness. So in this talk, I'm going to cover off on the new science, the new research on phytonutrients, talk about a laboratory assessment, a way to approach phytonutrient status, and then go through some client strategies for implementation. Please note that this is an educational and informational type of webinar, and it's not meant to replace or to give any kind of guidance as far as treatment or therapy. So here's the outline for the talk. I'm going to traverse through each of these different bullet points one at a time, and I'm going to start with making the case for plant-based diets. I know that many of us might be thinking already, well, you know, we know that we need to eat fruits and vegetables. And what we see out there is that it's clearly not happening. We see a lot of what I call the brown, white, and yellow diet, a lot of lackluster eating, a lot of fried foods, a lot of foods that aren't nutrient dense. They're more nutrient devoid. And what we see is that in addition, if we just look at the statistics of that, rather than just saying that, oh, I'm seeing this out there, in general, it's not that we have a shortage of these good, healthy foods. I am going to talk about accessibility, but in general, what we see, according to the World Health Organization recommendations, is about 400 grams daily of fruits and vegetables. And globally, we are coming in at about 209 grams of vegetables and 81 grams of fruits. So we're coming in a bit short of that 400 grams. And that's global. That's not specific to the United States. And of course, you can imagine that you see certain pockets where there are greater deficiencies and perhaps people are meeting their requirement. Maybe you as a nutrition professional or health professional of some type, or an educated, very well-informed, proactive person maybe you're getting that allotment. But I do want to talk more in terms of the quantity, but then also the quality and the variety, because if we look at what people are eating out there, there have been identified just shy of 1,100 different edible species, and we're not really accessing all of those, right? And how do we do that? I'm going to talk about that. So yes, we come up too short. Less than 10% of most Western populations consume adequate levels of whole fruits and dietary fiber. Typically, the average American gets about half of their requirement for dietary fiber. So about 15 grams of fiber per day, and we should be getting about 28 to 30 grams of fiber. So why are we not fulfilling what I would call our rainbow requirement? This is a recent survey that was published. And what they did was they looked at a number of different media releases, showed these to people, and then identified their responses as to why they weren't connecting into this message about eating more fruits and vegetables. And it came out in 4 different buckets. There may obviously be personal factors. You may see this as well with children not enjoying fruits and vegetables, maybe the taste, maybe the time, the resources. Oh, it takes time to actually prepare them, to go shopping for them. They go bad quickly. There's also the point of rejection that also has come out in terms of, do we really need fruits and vegetables? Being skeptical of the data. There's always that piece of just how important are fruits and vegetables. And I would say that's the piece I feel very passionate about, because me as a scientist over the years, this is what I've decided to sign up for because of the science. It's so strong, all the different types of studies out there. There's also a lack of knowledge, which is why we need the American Nutrition Association, is to help with education. How much is a portion? Some people get really caught into all of the details, the web of analysis on how much is a portion, what's a serving, what kinds of fruits count, how do I prepare those vegetables? And that's where we can really affect a lot of change in terms of education. And then, of course, there is what I was alluding to a little bit before about accessibility. What would be the cost of fruits and vegetables? What's the availability? Are people living in food deserts and they don't have access to these foods? So many different reasons why we're not meeting our daily requirement. And I would say because, too, and this is my own subjective input into this survey, that we haven't really made it beyond a public health message in the way of being science oriented. And I do think that bringing in more of the art, more of the play, more of the connection to mental health and mood might be a creative way to go about that. So yes, food is medicine. We've all heard that before, the Hippocrates quote from long ago. And my 21st century upgrade to that would be that it's really, if you start to dissect the literature, I would contend that colorful, whole, plant-based foods are nature's medicine. And the reason I say that is because if we look at nutrition in the nutrition field, many times we get caught within I would call it the pendulum of macronutrients, protein, carbohydrate, and fat, or even vitamins and minerals, the micronutrients. But there is another universe of food compounds that we're learning about. We don't see them on food labels as of yet, but there are so many different bioactives within plant foods that are providing this teamwork-like approach to give us protection against the risk for chronic disease, as an example, or helping us with inflammation inside the cell, or helping the cell to improve insulin sensitivity. So lots of different compounds, and I think that we're still coming into a deeper understanding of what we're actually taking in and how those actives convert through the gut microbiome to more secondary, even more active metabolites. I do think that there's something to this concept of food synergy. This concept was introduced in the literature sometime back in 2009. The idea that the whole of a plant is worth more than the individual parts. And I think that what has happened within the field of dietary supplementation is that we take a nutrient out and we give it to somebody in higher proportions than you may otherwise find it in nature and in isolation. And there is this connection with the whole of the person, the whole of the planet. And I do think we need to bring that into the whole of food, and how having whole foods in the right proportion found in nature is in that perfect, the ratios that we need, the proportions, all of that, the levels, in order to get the best synergy from that food itself. So I see a need for thinking in that holistic way. Many of you listening are very much drawn to holistic health, holistic nutrition, and seeing plants in that way as part of prevention, having a whole foods-based dietary pattern to buffer the effects from inflammation, et cetera. A lot of the insults that we're up against, whether it's toxic burden. I also think that there is a place where we can take something out of a plant and apply it for a more targeted therapeutic approach. So I do think that we can manage the best of both. Within the universe of plants, so these 25,000 or so different actives that I was alluding to, if we look at what is involved. So I started off talking about fruits and vegetables, but it's actually much bigger and broader than that. And I'd like for us to be thinking about the expansive nature of plants, that it's really not just fruits or it's not just vegetables. We have edible flowers to be thinking about. We have herbs and spices and legumes and nuts and seeds, whole grains. And I would even add to this list all the different formats like teas and juices and sauces and soups and broths. There's just so much here. And the impact of just having one meal with plants, as I'm looking at the literature, I realize how impactful it is just to see one meal full of plants and how that can change our physiology for hours afterwards. So there's a universe here to consider. And so it makes it easier to have the conversation with somebody who's wanting to move into more of a plant-based diet, that they can make baby steps into venturing into any one of these categories. Maybe it's just spices, just adding more in the way of spices to their daily meal in order to get more concentrated actives from these plants. There is the pushback that I often get about the anti-nutrients. They've been referred to as anti-nutrients, things like lectins and oxalates, or goitrogens, phytoestrogens, phytates, tannins, these types of things. Typically, the pushback that I get on having more plants in the diet is that, but wait a minute, there are certain people that are intolerant or sensitive to some of these, what we might call anti-nutrients in food. And so Weston Petrosky and I put together this review article that you can access. It's open access, so you can read the whole paper. We made it very science oriented and also clinically applied so that you can read it and really understand the takeaways. The takeaways for you within the context of this discussion is that, yes, indeed, there can be individuals that are sensitive to some or all of these different anti-nutrients. It just depends on our physiology. I think that if people are sensitive to these different compounds, it may denote that there are issues or imbalances or dysfunction in certain organs, whether there might need to be more balance within the gut microbiome, or perhaps we need to look to kidney health and excretion and elimination patterns. So I do think that rather than think of these as anti-nutrients, I think that they can be seen as certain messengers that we have in plants that can signal a larger issue in the body. And yes, I do think it's worthwhile to refrain from them if somebody is intolerant, allergic, sensitive, has a certain chronic condition that is exacerbated by these particular foods. Now, that said, I also want to have the message out there based on the review article that we did, that the way that we see fruits, vegetables, and different plant-based foods being used now is actually quite different than it's been used. A lot of these different foods have been used traditionally. So if we look back to traditional preparation methods, many of these plant-based foods were either soaked and sprouted, they were cooked, they were boiled, they were fermented. We're hearing so much about fermentation these days. They were milled. There was some kind of processing that was done to the plant food, and that made it a bit more acceptable in the diet. And I think what we're seeing now is that we live in a culture of a lot of raw smoothies and having a high intense intake of certain types of foods that weren't traditionally seen in the diet. And so we need to consider that it could be, yes, it's the individual and the physiology as it meets the food. It could also be because we are consuming many of these plant-based foods in different formats that haven't been seen over time. The 21st century has really spawned a whole number of different health trends. And I think that almost, I've been in the nutrition field for quite some time, over 25 years, and I've seen things come and go. And nutrition is fraught with all kinds of different shiny objects. And often we get the shiny object syndrome, what I call SOS, where we see something that seems to make sense, we immerse in it, and then we pull away from it. We we overdo it, right? And so I think back to the principle of looking at the precautionary principle, looking at balance, listening to one's body. All of these things, as you know, within the field of nutrition are of utmost importance. So one of the things that I have started to be thinking about with clients, especially because there are so many people that go from practitioner to practitioner because they have very challenging cases and they're looking for solutions. And it requires a lot of, I would say, almost detective work to really look at mechanism, look at root cause. And what ends up happening with some people who are very ill is that they're trying many different dietary approaches to the extent that they have eliminated so many of these different types of foods. And so I'm just going to put this concept out here because for many years I've done the elimination diet with clients. And what you do there is you omit foods and then you add them back after 21 to 28 days. And what I have seen is that for some people, they stick to just a handful of foods because they feel safe with that. But really what I would say from the literature that I see is that variety, diversity, botanical diversity in all ways in plants, small amounts of many versus large amounts of few seems to be more protective. So keep in mind too, that if people are allergic to foods, you don't want to be having foods come in. But I do think that having small amounts of many different types of foods rather than omitting a food category can help to build that physiological resilience. If you think about the gut microbiome, we need that diversity at the level of the gut. All right, so let's talk about the newer science. You all know that plants equal antioxidants, or at least I think you do, right? We've heard a lot about that, especially in the 1990s when there was a lot coming out about the free radical biology, oxidative stress, and how different antioxidants that were derived from plant foods were helpful for maintaining that inner balance of oxidative stress. But now we know that plants go beyond this. Indeed, we have the internal network of antioxidants, so much from the same lineage of research, whether it's vitamin E, and keep in mind that vitamin E is many different isomers. It's the tocopherols, it's the tocotrienols, and we find the complex array in plants. Vitamin C, of course, is another antioxidant. Polyphenols, we're hearing more about those, and carotenoids, whether it's beta carotene, beta cryptoxanthin, alpha carotene, lycopene, lutein, so many of those that we've heard about through the years, not just used in food, but then also being highlighted in dietary supplements. There's also the internal system of antioxidant defense enzymes, what I think is even more robust than ensuring that the body has replete levels of antioxidants from the diet is bolstering what our gene expression can produce in the way of enzymes to protect us. So that would be superoxide dismutase, catalase, glutathione peroxidase. These are just some examples of different enzymes that can be peaked to expression by way of some of the actives from different plant-based foods. And of course, we want to be thinking about the balance. When we take things out of their natural whole food context, many times we can go to the side and err to the side of too much. Remember the Goldilocks principle of not too little, not too much, but just right. Having that right in that center point, and that center point will be different for every person. And that is what the ANA talks about all the time, personalized nutritional needs. What we also see is that plants are a buffer against environmental toxicity. One of the other topics that I teach on repeatedly is that of environmental health. Person health equals planetary health. As above, so below, as within, so without. And what we're learning as it relates to environmental health and metabolic detoxification is that we may not be able to blunt the toxic burden that we're confronted with every day because it's out there through food, air, and water. But what we can do is buffer our body's response to what we're confronted with. And that can come by way of different things that we have within a plant-based diet. So lots of great publications emerging on that front. And I think it's hopeful and it empowers people because there's a lot of fear around toxicity, right? Just to think that, wow, my environment's not safe. Well, plants are our divining rod to helping our body to be more intelligent within this very toxic environment, right? It's going to help us, the plants will help us to be smarter and to defend ourselves in creative ways at the cellular level. Plants also help with mental health. And during this time of lots of sleep disturbance and mental health issues, whether increased rates of depression or anxiety, what we see is that eating more fruits and vegetables has been associated with less psychological distress and better mood. This is just a little snapshot of the science that's out there. And some of these are larger studies. I do think that for the most part, that most people know that eating plant-based foods are probably a better thing, but what they don't get just yet, and they need you to educate them, is that these types of foods, eating colorful plant-based foods, can help with a colorful mood. And that's more new. I would say that this is more emerging work. What we also see along those same lines, I would call this the power of plants for empowerment. That seeing that even if you look at this one study here, evolution of well-being and happiness after increases in consumption of fruits and vegetables, that having more fruits and vegetables was associated with greater happiness, greater life satisfaction, greater quality of life, greater well-being. In fact, if you were to metricize those qualitative effects, it was the equivalent of going from unemployment, which typically creates a lot of stress for people, to employment. So that jump, that quantitative jump, was what was seen with increased fruits and vegetables, like really being associated with de-stressing. And I think that that is something that people need to hear this at this time. And perhaps we need to continue to bring out that message and refresh it in so many different ways. Now, what we also see is the newer documented effects is that science is really starting to validate what we've known from a traditional medicine system, that of eating with the seasons. Now, I'm not going to take you through the granularity of this particular animal study, but essentially what they showed was that when you have fruit, and in this particular study, they were looking at oranges that were grown through the northern and the southern hemispheres, given to rats that had either more of a summer photo period or a winter photo period. So they used light to mimic that. And what they found was that having the orange from the southern hemisphere during the winter type of photo period caused more fat accumulation in terms of the phenotype. And there was a difference in phytochemicals between the orange in the northern hemisphere versus in the southern hemisphere, just about 39 different phytochemicals. And so you can see right there the power of food and food consumption within particular seasons. So I'm excited about this because I always like to see what has been known more intuitively as traditional wisdom, and how do we bring more of the science into understanding the mechanism. Because some people are more driven by more of, I would say, the head knowledge, the information, the science, and that beautifully supports the art and the wisdom of what was known. And this is the image that really goes along with that. So seeing here on the left, how when we eat foods in season, it creates that harmonization of metabolism. And perhaps this is at the level of what we would say the clock genes, right? It's the whole system of the circadian rhythm, the diurnal rhythm of sun and moon, of light and dark. And I think that there's so much there we don't understand. But I do think that there's more emerging, and I think it's exciting in the field of nutrition. There's even this term chrononutrition that has been circulating for some time, looking at the influence of foods eaten during certain times of the day, right? We're hearing a lot about intermittent fasting and how it's not just what we eat, but when we eat it, that can have a great impact. So let's get into mechanisms just briefly. As I've been alluding to, plants are very pleiotropic. They wear many hats. They're doing many different things. The three main mechanisms that I think of when it comes to plants, and you might want to be thinking about this in a clinical setting, is that plants can help at the cellular level with reducing inflammation, helping the cells to sensitize to insulin and hormones, and helping to modulate stress. That's where we get the term adaptogen from. So we've got these three mechanisms. And me as a scientist, I think in terms of mechanism, not so much an ICD-10 code or diagnosis, but I want to know what's happening. Is there something awry with the inflammation oxidative cascade? Or is the body not responsive to hormones? Or is there hormone imbalance? Or is there just too much stress? And stress signals are flooding the cell, making it not very responsive. Well, the good thing is that plants can help to modulate multiple of these mechanisms. And I would say, I put this in a table form just so that you could see that beyond antioxidants, we're seeing that plants can have functional roles. So where they're actually, I think for most nutritionists, what they think of is probably beta carotene being able to convert into something functional like vitamin A. But we also know that beta carotene is important in the body in a variety of different functions. The structural role that a number of these different phytonutrients are going to certain parts in the body and playing a role in function. Keep in mind that structure and function go hand in hand. I'm sure you learned that from your physiology courses, right? So the structure of something is often leading and creates that sense of function. They act as cell signaling messengers, and that's what I was alluding to with those three different pathways. They act as substrates for the gut microbiome, which is why diversity is key. They help with DNA repair, and that really gets at probably more of the antioxidant aspect. And then, of course, more of the 21st century research around the genome and even the epigenome, looking at epigenetic modification through different actives in plants, different phytonutrients, whether it's the sulforaphane in broccoli or the lycopene in tomatoes or resveratrol in grapes. We're starting to see that there are these post-translational changes made to the DNA that can lead to turning certain genes on or off. So I'm hoping that you're getting the idea that plants are a big deal from multiple different aspects. So how do we start to make the translation? I've given you a whole menu of different scientific mechanisms and what we're seeing in the research, but now I want to transition the conversation into more application. How do you actually implement this? How can you get the word out and inspire people? So first and foremost, I would say if we're looking at reducing the risk of chronic diseases, the preponderance of data would say that the goal is to aim for 5 servings of fruits and vegetables per day. The 5-a-day initiative, we've heard a lot about that. Yet we still see, based on this particular survey that was done some time ago in 2009, that most people fall short in terms of a color in their diet. They're not getting that. And the challenge here for us, or I would say perhaps the opportunity, is that how can we create ways to help people to be informed as to the colors that they are taking in? Because reading a nutrition facts label won't actually call out those phytochemicals. The closest that we might be able to get is by looking at the dietary fiber content. Now, for some of you nutrition sleuths, and you like more of the research side, you probably already know about the USDA nutrient days. And now the USDA nutrient database has more information on things like flavonoids, proanthocyanidins, isoflavones, carotenoids, but still we do not have a very comprehensive repository of these thousands of different phytochemicals. So it becomes rather difficult to make sure that we are quantitatively looking at what the intake is, right? So we're going to have to look at more of the qualitative aspects, more of the diet diaries. So this is the family of phytochemicals that I typically think about. And I want you to get a little bit comfortable with some of these terms. I think that for some health professionals, they feel very overwhelmed by phytochemicals because they kind of feel like, wow, there's so many different compounds to remember. Well, I would say that if we're looking at this as a family tree, we've got the carotenoids here over to the far right. And typically I think of these as the red, the orange, and the yellow compounds that we see in nature. And then if you go all the way to the far left, the phenolics. We hear a lot about the phenolics these days. The phenolics breaks out into its own little family tree here. And we see here, you see the flavonoids. So under flavonoids, then we see a further breakout into all of these compounds at the bottom. And we've heard a lot about the isoflavones, right? We've heard a lot about anthocyanidins in the blue-purple foods. So if we can just focus on just even remembering carotenoids for the fat-soluble compounds, phenolics for the most part tend to be water-soluble and tend to be connected to the flavonoids, which I'm sure you'll see much more research emerging if you track that type of thing. I think that those would be the more notable compounds. Of course, we could be talking about alkaloids, or we can talk about the dietary nitrates. So things like the leafy greens that are high in nitrates that create nitric oxide in the body, or the sulfur-containing compounds such as in the cruciferous vegetables, or even phytosterols, which we've heard a lot about, I would say, in the past decades, when foods were fortified with different phytosterols to help with certain healthy lipid markers. So based on that, I would say what we're going to see coming out is probably a dietary phytochemical index. We don't quite have that yet. It's used in research. And if you look at the studies, what we see is that the term was first introduced in 2004. It basically connects into the amount of phytochemical density within the total amount of calories that we take in. So currently it's being used as a research metric. But imagine that eventually, and I'm visioning this out and imagining that one day, much like the glycemic index, we'll be able to talk with clients about a phytochemical index. So with glycemic index, we think of lower being better. With phytochemical index, greater is better. We want a higher number. And already we're starting to see some relationships, some associations in the data with things like body mass index, waist circumference, waist to hip ratio, and even plasma oxidative stress. We may also be looking at a dietary diversity score. And I am a huge proponent of variety. If we look at our ancestral diet, we averaged at about 3,000 different plant species. But currently, I would say that we probably only access about 100 on a more regular basis, which may seem like a lot, but in the scope of the universe of plants and what we have historically had access to, it's really just a fraction. Dietary variety may have health benefits for a number of different parameters: blood pressure, oxidative damage, even risk of falls. So we see the benefits of variety throughout the lifespan, whether it's with infants all the way into more of an aged population, looking at a variety of different markers. So adding just one food or one spice has been shown to have an impact. And I really want to drive that home within this webinar, because many people think, oh, I have to transition to a plant-based diet. That's a lot of work. I don't want to have to think about it. I don't want to have to think about recipes. Rather than think of that big mountain to climb, what I would say is let's just take one step on the path. And one step could be just having more spice in one's meal. And we know of the impact of that. So diversity in all things, as I've been saying, a diverse microbiome will be more adaptable. Diversity of the gut is associated with having these diverse components. Unfortunately, as I mentioned, the plant window has become very narrow, and we have to find creative ways to expand it open again, which we will do. You know, it takes some time to move into that greater thinking about possibilities for food and trying different things, even if it's one new food a week, one new spice a week, one new tea a week. If we look at the American gut data, which all of you can access, it's part of the Citizen Science Project. Lots of different data points have been emerging from that. And what we see is that most recently, and this was published in April 2021, is that those people who were eating greater than 30 plant types per week, so that's just 30. We're not even talking 100 or 1,000, just greater than 30 plant types per week had greater short chain fatty acid fermentation compared to those just eating less than 10 plant types per week. Now, short chain fatty acids, you probably know this, they're signaling agents for the immune system, satiety. They help with the milieu of the gut. And so they have many different functions within the gut, and we know of their therapeutic benefit. Just by having plants, we can help to facilitate the production of short chain fatty acids. You probably know too that there are even dietary supplements being created with things like butyrate. Butyrate is an example of one of those short chain fatty acids. So I would say, rather than just have one short chain fatty acid and to have high amounts in a supplement, why not get a variety through the different plant types, which then create the diversity in the gut? If you look at the data on diversity, and I'm just segueing a little bit here before we get a little bit more into the quantification, of course. Diversity, I'm leading the stage and setting this path into giving you a tool to help navigate variety. Because what we see here is decreased food allergy, especially for young children. So the more diverse their diet early on in life, the better. Even the maternal diet can alter child outcomes for risk of allergic or autoimmune disease. So much literature is coming out on looking at the prenatal or even the diet of a pregnant woman, and what we see is part of the child's trajectory from that point forward. So what's the takeaway for you? What's the clinical pearl? How do you actually make this real and hit the ground running? I would say that you could do this in a variety of ways, and a variety for a variety, right? That's a little bit of a play on words. What I would say is one way to do this is with a variety tracker. This is my own personal variety tracker that I've used in groups, I've used with people, looking at getting 50 foods over the course of 7 days. And as you can see on the right, the description is on the left, what counts as a food. And here's where I don't focus on having a certain quantity, like it doesn't have to be a set serving. It's more about just getting exposure to even small amounts through a spice or through a cup of tea. And it doesn't, again, have to be like 1 cup of leafy greens. I don't want people to get too fixated on amounts. I just want them to focus on variety, like a canvas with lots of different splotches of paint, right? I want to see that diversity in the average meal. That is really the goal of the variety tracker. So you can create your own sense of that. You can also go and download this. You can use this if that would be helpful. But just to aim for something like 50 foods within that 7-day time frame. So this is just a little sampling of what that looks like when you put it into motion. My own personal meals, especially during 2020, when I was really trying to think, wow, how do we really create more resilience through everyday meals and create creativity when we feel maybe kind of stuck, right? We're at home, we're doing the same thing every day. Through that daily meal, we can bring in more, not just color, but also creativity. So one of the messages, as you might be aware of, as you can allude to from my discussion here, is that I do think it's really important to eat the rainbow. This paper is also available to you, open access. You can get it and you can read it. I talk about the rainbow diet color code, how each of these colors of foods has more or less a pattern recognition. It has a certain physiological signature. Red foods, the immune system; orange foods, the fat-soluble tissues, the carotenoids, reproductive health; the yellow foods, the catalytic ability for the gut, the prebiotic fibers; green foods in the heart. Here's where the nitrates and the vitamin K come in, the folates; blue-purple with the anthocyanidins, the flavonoids for the brain. So I detail this color code type system within that scientific paper so that you can understand more of the rationale of how I arrived at this particular categorization. So the color coded plants, these aren't firm boxes or categories or classifications. It's more of looking at nature as clusters and of pigments and the art of eating for certain benefits. So very quickly, I'm going to tour you quickly through the rainbow, and then I'm going to start taking you into a laboratory assessment of how you can indirectly get a sense of these. Red, as I mentioned, is all about inflammation. And when I think of the phytochemicals in the particular diet, I have them listed in the paper. Here are the fruits, the vegetables, the phytochemicals, the physiological effects. To me, red is about inflammation. It denotes inflammation in the body. It's part of the hallmarks. It's one of the hallmarks: redness, pain, heat, swelling. It's part of the profile of inflammation. And to that point, red colored foods can also help in quelling the inflammatory response. Now, in some cases, they can also propel it, such as for some people, if we're looking at this within a personalized framework, things like tomatoes can exacerbate, whether it's a nightshade type of sensitivity, or even if we look at histamines, which are contained in things like strawberries. So there is this connection of red to more of the inflammatory immune cascade, I would say. With orange, I think of the carotenoids, and carotenoids for the most part tend to be fat soluble. And fat soluble substances live within the adipose tissue or the fat containing compartments of the body. And many times we see these connected to hormones. Hormones are, for the most part, fat soluble. And so here we have the fruits, we have the vegetables, the different phytochemicals. And by the way, these are short lists of phytochemicals. I talked about thousands of them, but I'm really showcasing a handful so we can wrap our intellect around this a little bit, because otherwise, again, it becomes too overwhelming. I do think of these beautiful carotenoids in nature. Just think of autumn, when the leaves on trees go from being chlorophyll green rich, and then that starts to degrade, and then you start to see the colors. And that's why often green foods will contain other colors. You just can't see them outright. The carotenoids also look like fatty acids, don't they? We can see that long polyene chain, which is very, very representative and very close to the structure of something like a fatty acid. So the two really go very nicely hand in hand. Things like fats, essential fatty acids, and carotenoids. They do tend to protect us a little bit more when there's oxidative stress. They're embedded into the fat soluble tissues of the body, things like the brain, the breast, and even the skin. So they help to, some of them do convert into vitamin A, and other times they're there because they're helping with balance, they're helping with gene expression, they're doing lots of different things. Yellow is the next color. And when I think of yellow, I think of digestive health. Sometimes we need to have green foods in order to get the yellow pigments as well. And when I'm thinking about green foods, I'm thinking about things like kale. So here I put the more traditional yellow foods, but there can be green foods like kale and parsley and basil that contain lutein, which is seen as more of a yellow pigmented phytochemical, tends to collect in the back of the eye and to be protective there. Green foods for cardiovascular health, heart health, and there are so many different green fruits and vegetables, especially, and many different phytochemicals. When I think of nature and eating nature's foods, I think of a green food. And what I have found, and this is just more on my clinical experience side, is that most people can get something green every day. It's the other colors that tend to be more challenging. But because there's the majority of our plant foods tend to be green, so it's a little bit easier for people to get these foods in their daily diet. We think of chlorophyll, which is a dietary chelator. It's also an antioxidant. And if you look at the structure here, it looks a lot like our hemoglobin, which has iron in the middle. It's very protective and it's a great binder. So if we're having things that aren't as healthy in the diet, when we have chlorophyll containing foods together with things that are maybe grilled or fried, it can tend to bind those different inflammatory compounds and draw them out of the body. So chlorophyll is great for that reason. And in fact, I think that chlorophyll is trending a bit on the nutritional side. I'm starting to see at the store things like chlorophyll shots, like it's a new thing. You know, chlorophyll is as old as plants are, but it's good. It's good to create that awareness around chlorophyll and all of the healing that it can help our bodies to accomplish. And then we have blue-purple foods. Purple is precious. It doesn't occur very widely in nature like green does. So I think about the fruits, a lot of the berries. I think about the purple varieties of vegetables that maybe typically aren't in that purple color. Select phytochemicals and the brain impact. Brain, mood, memory, cognition. There are a lot of data that would suggest that having blueberries, Concord grape juice, these compounds that are found in the blue-purple fruits and vegetables seem to be protective and localized into the brain, especially in certain parts responsible for learning and memory. All right, so you've now seen the rainbow a bit. So this is the 3-part rainbow, eating the rainbow toolkit. So this is a one-pager on the why, the what, the how, and the where. Then there's the rainbow food tracker, so that every day to really not just to focus on the amount of food, but just the color of food. It's like rainbow bingo, and it's fun for families to do. It's fun for kids to do, and adults. It's a very simple tracking device, and people can do this manually. They can put it on the refrigerator. They can even just take pictures of their food throughout the day, and then at the end of the day, assess where they're at with their rainbow. And please note that I also included brown and white foods on this tracker. And oftentimes under purple, I put blue and black, because if you think of blackberries, well, they have a lot of those blue-purple compounds, and the density is so great that the hue becomes this very enriched, beautiful black color. I don't put it on this tracker because I don't want to make things complicated, but when I'm explaining it, I often say that purple connects into blue, purple, and black compounds, like a blackberry, or even in some blueberries that are very deeply hued. And with brown, I often think of tan and beige, so a bit of the spectrum of brown. And white, I know that white is a curious color to put on a rainbow tracker, but remember that it's the white light going through a prism that creates the rainbow, right? And there can be healthy white foods like coconut and garlic and parsley and cauliflower. So I don't want us to forget white either. I know when I was growing up with my health conscious mom, she used to say, the whiter the bread, the quicker you're dead. And I had this idea that white bread, white flour, white sugar, all of these things were not good. And, you know, there's a certain valid message to that. But I had this idea that white foods in general were not healthy. But there are components and different types of white foods that can be healthy and part of that full rainbow. And then that makes for the 7 days of the week. It makes it an easier message for you to convey to somebody in order to keep them throughout the week, right? You can also do this where the first day you focus on red foods and you say, okay, let's just see if you can get red foods. The second day, orange foods, etc. And you go through the rainbow that way before you graduate them into getting the rainbow every day. Here's the shopping list. Most people don't know what falls into what category. And so I've found that this has been helpful for people to be thinking about where they would find these things, how they stack up in the grocery store, and then how to translate that in terms of their Eat the Rainbow tracker. All right, so that's 1, 2, 3, the justification, the metric, and then the tool to actually help with the tracker and the shopping of it all. So that's just one practical way to do that. Now, for those of you who are like labs, I'm going to go through this a bit because this is where so many people, they really want some type of more stringent analytical property to really help to understand how are these phytochemicals working in the body, more indirect means. So I just gave more of the qualitative, more of the artful display. That would be something that you can do concurrent with something like the laboratory evaluation. So if you're a nutrition professional, you could be doing those things. You could be doing a 3-day or a 7-day journal, a diet diary, or a food log. You can do the pictures on the phone and then have them send their pictures, their meals to you. You can have them count colors of food rather than their calories. I always find that much more refreshing. So as a nutrition professional, that is really par for the course, right? That is what many of you were already trained to do. And then if you're seeing them in person or even through a virtual interface, you can gauge a bit around a physical exam, right? So looking at things on the skin, looking at nails, looking at hair, or even just asking about those things. What about the lips, cracking of the lips? What about changes in skin growths? So there are many different things that we could be examining there on the side of being a nutrition professional, even without touching the patient, just having them review and send pictures of things like their tongue, changes in their eyes. And we all know, well, I have noticed this, that people are very attentive to changes in their appearance. And sometimes even more so than what they're eating every day. They can't remember those things, but they do know when certain things change. And when those things are changing, those are great indicators, great messengers to help them course correct potentially with foods. So that is part of your nutritional toolkit, right? Now, if you're able to order labs, and for some of you, you're health professionals where you're primary care practitioners and you're able to order labs outright. So that's great. I just want to speak to all people watching the webinar, whether you're able to do that as a primary provider, or maybe you're working with a primary provider where they're able to order labs. I think it can be useful. In fact, I just had my labs done. I try to get my labs done twice a year so that I get a sense of how did I do after the winter months, the darker months? How did I do after the summer months? So I want to look at things like vitamin D. I want to look at my essential fatty acids. I want to look at a lot of these different functional markers. So typically you can order labs within the scope of your practice. And typically what we see is that there are other indications. It's not just a seasonal one, like I just mentioned for myself, and I'm relatively healthy. But if there are people that are presenting with clinical conditions, things like stress and fatigue and their lifestyle, they're worn out and they need to see a number. Often somebody needs to see a number in order to make a change. There can be many different reasons to do this. So how do you know if they're getting adequate phytochemicals? Well, you can look at some indirect measures, and I'm just going to top line those for you. And then I'm going to take you through a sequence of labs so that you can understand how you can take knowing about what somebody is eating and an emphasis on phytochemicals and draw that through a more quantitative assessment approach through labs. So first and foremost, I think of inflammaging, which if we have inflammation in the body, which I don't know if you know, but there's just been a new term introduced called coagulaging. So inflammation typically leads to greater coagulation, which is not a great thing, right? You don't want your blood to be coagulating and clotting. This can set the stage for heart disease and stroke. So with phytochemicals, we get built-in protection, as I've been talking about, with measures of blunting oxidative stress and inflammation. So if we see indicators of high inflammation in the body, that would tell us that probably the person needs more in the way of phytochemicals. They may already be eating a plant-based diet. They may already be doing their best, in which case here's where you would introduce something like therapeutic amounts of certain known actives to intervene and start to break the cycle of inflammation in the body. So I've listed here some of the markers of inflammaging: high sensitivity C-reactive protein, low vitamin D. Vitamin D is on everybody's radar these days. High fasting glucose of above 90 milligrams per deciliter, also looking at fasting insulin. Low omega-3 index. Why? Because we know that omega-3s and omega-6s need to be in balance for good, healthy inflammatory status. looking at body composition. So are they losing their muscle mass? Are they gaining more fat mass? And what about homocysteine? Also, you can look directly at oxidative stress markers. That's not something that's commonly done. The other ones that I mentioned as part of the inflammatory profile are much more common. But for more specialized investigation into oxidative stress, these might be some that you would look at. So, and typically these are urinary measures. These are markers in the urine because you're looking at the output, the metabolism. When would I look at something like that? Typically, if somebody has a high toxic load, you want to see the impact of environmental toxicants. You might be looking at oxidative stress markers. You might also be looking at oxidative stress markers as markers of aging, accelerated aging. You can also look directly at vitamins and minerals. I'm going to tour you through that, so I won't speak to that now. You can look at hemoglobin A1C, autoantibodies to look at the initial the starting point of autoimmune disease, which we know these autoantibodies, many times they're showing up 7 to 14 years before the actual manifestation of an autoimmune disease. So keep that in mind. The earlier you can be tracking these on a lab, the earlier you can course correct through more of an anti-inflammatory, high phytonutrient density approach. And then, of course, lowered immune function, which ties into inflammation. There are a number of other segments for nutrition professionals and other health professionals to key into that can give you other types of, I would say, intelligence about what somebody can be doing. So the way I'm going to cluster these is to think about them in categories. Organic acids, which say something about the metabolic cycles, the different cofactors, where there's a buildup or where there's a shortage, and that could infer that we need certain nutrients. Oxidative stress, I've already addressed. Amino acids, looking at protein, looking at essential fatty acids, which I have a lot of passion around. My whole PhD and doctoral work was looking at essential fatty acid absorption and metabolism. And I do think we can learn a lot from an essential fatty acid panel, much more than just even an omega-3 index. Then there's the nutrient and toxic element panel. So that's when you suspect, and I would say that most people do have a toxic load or a burden that puts strain and takes nutrient reserves, right? So it's so important to get a window into what are those toxicants. And then, of course, some of you are really keen on looking at SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphisms, looking at these gene variants to already let you know constitutionally whether or not that person has increased need or decreased need for certain nutrients. So this is a very robust test, 125 markers all put together. Somebody just asked me recently, hi, Deanna, I'm going to my doctor. I'm pretty healthy, but I still want to have a general sense of my whole nutritional profile. What am I taking in? And I recommended this because it is very comprehensive with all of these different categories and breakouts. So I would say it captures the metabolome. What is the metabolome? We hear a lot about nutrigenomics, genomics, the estrobolome, which is more the estrogen focused type of genome. This is looking at, remember this chart? I don't know if any of you were kind of nerdy like me, where you had a whole chart of all of the different pathways that happen in the body. It's amazing just to think of the inner workings of how we all just sit here right now while all of these reactions are happening, and all of the reserves and the amazingness of the body. Just to be thinking about that just for a second. And how do you get a window into this? How do you get a snapshot into it? Well, oftentimes it requires a lab to be looking at what are the metabolites. Let's pull those out. Let's get a functional readout so that we can see the body's machinery behind the scenes. I find it really staggering to think about how so much is happening and how so much of it goes right. I just want to focus on that just as a positive note, because so many of us think about, oh my gosh, we get our lab and we focus on what's wrong, what's out of balance. And we're not focused on, wow, this is within the range and I did really well on this. and to, I just had a call yesterday with a medical doctor friend of mine where we did take my labs, and I wanted to get his take because I have my take on labs, but sometimes it helps to have somebody look into your own physiology with their eyes rather than your own personal eyes. And it is a practitioner's default to, I think, go to the L's and the H's on the lab report, right? The lows and the highs. And I would say to also be looking at the composite, draw your eyes away from this like a piece of art and say, wow, look at how many of these things, like 22 different things came out A-okay. It's just that maybe these 2 or 3, or maybe these 5 or 7, or maybe these 10 need some focus. Well, what do they tell us as a pattern? This is, in my mind, again, being a scientist first and then a clinician second, that we see pattern recognition with a lab. So yes, it's a snapshot. Yes, we have to know its limitations. And we can also get a nice window into what could be happening at the pattern level. So within this particular test, with all of these different categories, looking at direct indicators of nutrient deficiency, and the way that is being looked at is when there's a cofactor. For example, magnesium being used in the activity of vitamin D. That's a direct indicator. That's functional in terms of its indication. It can also be in the case of vitamin B12. If there's a deficiency, we start to see a buildup of certain metabolites that we can measure, right? So what we can see is the direct indication of where cofactors are used, and these are nutrients, and we can see the outcome of not getting the final product of that reaction. So many times that's how a test of that nature is done. We can also look at intracellular and extracellular measures. So these are just the pockets of those. Extracellular, outside the cell, looking at metabolites coming through urine. Intracellular, looking more at organic acids, because that would say something about the Krebs cycle, right? The TCA cycle that we know about. Looking at essential fatty acids, which are more embedded within the cellular membrane. And so through those two interfaces, we can also get some direct exposure through a lab report. So what I'm going to do is just quickly take you through a case of a 59-year-old woman. Her chief complaints were fatigue, anxiety, poor sleep, gas and bloating. She was already doing a pretty good Mediterranean diet, which tends to be more plant-based already. She was doing fish 4 times per week. She was on a recent course of antibiotics, and she is taking a few supplements. She takes a multivitamin and ashwagandha to help with her stress, and she does do some yoga. So she's a pretty conscious person, I would say, in the way of having some stress-related, lifestyle-induced type of issues, and she's already doing a number of things. So that's why it's a test like this would be wonderful, just for seeing, okay, is there something that we need to focus just a little bit more on? And so you can see the lab profile here, where the red denotes that we need to pay attention to that, right? And so in her case, what you will see is that for her, it was much more about toxic exposures. But she fared quite well on her inflammatory support through the omega-3 balance, and also on her methylation support. She could have improved a little bit on antioxidants and mitochondrial support. So this helps with clinical recommendations around not just the fundamentals of plants as the bedrock. There might be some tweaks there. And the fact that she's having fish so often might need some tweaking, because we're seeing some toxic exposures here. That's already, what we might be surmising. So through the lab, you get a sense of a quantified scale. I love this because it's a spectrum. It allows your attention to go to one place. And one of the things that I hear commonly from nutrition professionals and even other types of health providers is that they feel so scattered. There's so many things to look at that they don't know how to just focus on one thing. And many times just focusing on one thing where you see that there's need for support through a lab like this can ripple through the other things and create more balance in those as well. what you see here in terms of the nutrient need overview is part of the lab report. You get the antioxidants, the B vitamins, the minerals, the essential fatty acids, and also gastrointestinal support with some suggested recommended dosages. Now, keep in mind that those are just standard benchmarks for the general population based on this particular range, but you may want to personalize that further. The nutrient needs, so based on the individual's nutrient levels, they come out with the individual rating for each, whether they're in the green, they're in the yellow, they're in the red, and then what are some, I would say, some takeaways. This takes a lot of the education away from you, or at least bolsters what you're already doing, because it gives key points about each nutrient, gives the clinical importance, and then furthermore, this is the gold. It gives you the food sources. So it's right there at a glance where you could say, okay, I clearly need to focus on riboflavin. Why? Let me get my head around that knowledge. And then how? What are the foods to enable me to make that change? And in this particular case study, riboflavin was her issue. You can see it's in the red. So this, you can see here very clearly what it's doing, when it might be depleted, and what are the food sources. And then you can tailor that to the client's diet. The organic acid type of cycle here, where you can see metabolic end products. I'm not going to tour you through all of those, but this is really wonderful because you get a sense of oxalates, vitamin markers, cellular energy, mitochondria. We hear so much about energy production and mitochondrial health. Well, what are the cofactors of that? You get a beautiful window into those pathways with this part of the lab. So blown up a little bit more, you could see again the citric acid cycle and how we need nutrients to drive energy production. And if there's something that's blocked where you get a buildup of a certain compound, then you know that whatever was preceding it, perhaps there's a shortage of the cofactors that are utilized in order to create that compound. You also get a mitochondrial dysfunction score. I really like that as well, that we tie into not just the citric acid cycle on its own, but then also further, if you go down below into the electron transport chain, right? Oxidative phosphorylation, looking at the complete picture, starting with the macronutrients, funneling that through acetyl-CoA, looking at ketogenesis, citric acid cycle, and then further on to the electron transport chain. This is a window into metabolism, right? So many people want to know about their metabolism. Metabolism changes. So how can we be better informed nutritionally to look at the different nutrients required? Because there could be a natural block here because we are insufficient or deficient in a certain nutrient. We can also, from the organic acid report, look at malabsorption markers. This comes in handy. I have a lot of passion around looking at dysbiosis, which is an imbalance in the gut microbiome, especially as it relates to yeast, fungus. We know that this is playing a huge role in people's health these days. And so you get a little window into that as well. It's like a menu, right? You get a lot of many different markers so that you can start to put it together. So I was just talking about fungus, yeast, candida. D-arabinitol is one of the byproducts of candida. And so if we look at this as an indirect assessment of candida overgrowth, I mean, many times we can look at this symptomatically. We can look at this from the diet perspective, such as, are they getting too much in the way of simple carbohydrates and not enough in the way of fats and proteins? So there are some novel markers here that make this a bit more specific to particular organisms that we might be keyed into, like candida. Vitamin markers, as I mentioned before, the functional markers. So being able to look at methylation, branch chain catabolites, biotin markers, all really important information. Toxicity and detoxification, one of my loves. Strange to say that, but it's just, once you have a hammer, everything starts to look like a nail, right? And I just see so much being connected to toxic load. And you do get some information about toxicity through this report. And you can just even say that lower nutrient status can confer more risk towards the effects of toxic burden, i.e. oxidative stress and inflammation. But there are some specific markers. And further, there are specific tests that go further into levels of parabens and phthalates and heavy metals. You could really go down the rabbit hole on that. But this is, again, the big picture, the huge expanse, the spectrum to give you a general sense. Oxalate markers. Remember how I was talking about oxalates? So many people want to know about oxalates in plant-based foods. Well, you can get a better sense of oxalate markers, which tie into things like stones in the body, especially kidney stones, very painful, very damaging. And people that have had kidney stones definitely need to be watching their diet and start to create more of a functional pattern around elimination. So you do get a little bit of a window into oxalate markers in this test. Oxidative damage I've already addressed, really important, not just for looking at inflammation status, but then also toxic burden, also looking at a marker, collectively looking at it as a marker of accelerated aging. Then here's one of my passions. I mentioned toxicity is one of my passions. The other one is essential amino acids and the fatty acids. So here you get the amino acids. So especially to be looking at this for vegans and vegetarians who may need to be consciously putting together certain proteins and making sure that they're having the different pools of amino acids for different peptides that are used functionally in the body. And then alongside the amino acids, looking at the fatty acids. And here you could see the breakout of not just the omega-3 index, but the omega-3 fatty acids, omega-6 fatty acids, and then the other families of fats too. Now, here's just a little tip. If somebody is, you can see even if omega-9 is low, having people bring in something like olive oil, looking at trans fats. If trans fats are too high, and trans fat, you can see over here, if it's in the red, this to me is an indirect marker that they're having perhaps more processed foods. And so that's telling me, oh, they're having more snack foods, and to ask them and query them about that on their diet diary. The saturated monos are there, cardiovascular risk. I've been talking about the omega-3 index, but you have other indices here as well. And those are all explained in the report, just to refresh your memory so you don't have to remember all this stuff, because it's not just the fatty acids themselves, but then also the enzymes that are responsible for the conversion of the parent fatty acid into the longer chain unsaturated fatty acids, right? And those tend to be the more active ones for things like inflammation or prostaglandin synthesis, leukotriene activity. Each of those enzymes require cofactors, and so you can get some eye or lens into each of these different enzymes or cofactors that are required just by looking at the essential fatty acids. And then the toxic elements, which I mentioned. So looking at right here, you have on the left the toxic metals and the toxic elements, right next to the essential elements. Now, keep in mind that there's a relationship between the two. Toxic metals and essential elements, they both tend to have the same type of chemical configuration. So they tend to compete. So somebody that tends to skew low in the essential minerals will tend to skew higher in toxic metals. Not always the case, but you might want to be looking at that on the lab report. You can also do add-ons of genes, and some of these genes, especially as they relate to methylation, can be helpful. And then finally, with the treatment plan that I mentioned to you, which you can go further and personalize, right? So these are the generic ranges, but you're going to know much more about the client. You're going to know much more about their symptoms and how you can tweak things relative to their ability to make some changes, and also what cost you're looking at. All right, so for her specifically, it was to lower her toxic burden, diversify her protein and her fat, less toxic seafood, increased dietary fiber. Now, she was low in riboflavin, so making sure that she had additional riboflavin, adding in some glutathione support, some glycine before bed to help with sleep, as well as detoxification. And then some lifestyle type of interventions, some modalities to help her deal with family and work stress, encouraging her to continue her yoga practice, which can help to modulate stress, of course. And then to follow up on the test again in about 6 to 12 months. And I think by that time you can see seasonally what changes there have been. And also sometimes it takes a little bit for these changes to take effect, right? In terms of their motivation to change and then their physiology to actually change depending on their age and their resilience. And going further with a number of other panels, whether looking at the stool analysis, I might do detoxification. I might look a little bit deeper at her toxic elements. All right, so let's pull this together. I know I've gone a little bit over the hour here. Thank you for your patience. And I hope you walk away from this with some general sense of different personalized diet interventions, as well as different types of nutritional supplementation regimens that can be designed based on whether it's the qualitative approach, what they're taking in, as well as a laboratory approach. Now, keep in mind, I want to let you know that this paper was just published in June of 2021. I found it fascinating because it was talking about how personalization of nutritional approaches need to be synced up with psychological characteristics of an individual. So if we can tune in and have our EQ, our emotional intelligence, at the level of our IQ, so that we're reading and understanding levels of motivation, what is really fueling somebody's desire to change, we can anchor that more fully and strongly into the types of interventions that we might be recommending. So how do we maximize phytochemicals? I've given you so many ideas. The variety piece, I hope that you take home. Being creative, trying out different things, spices and teas being great, especially for people with low access to fresh foods. And spices and teas tend to keep very well over time, right? And they tend to concentrate the phytochemicals. Growing our own food, foraging, visiting nature, and being in parks. Even I think of dandelion leaves. I think of how many people don't want dandelions growing on their lawn, but then I think about, wow, dandelions, the leaves, just a really wonder. I pay good money for dandelion leaves at my food co-op. So it's like, how do we get to know our own environment? Even if we are living in the city, there are so many things even around us where we can access and start to learn more about our planet, right? So variety is the spice of life. Absolutely. Smaller amounts of many. I would love you to take this away with you into your clinical work. Smaller amounts of many, better than larger amounts of few. Getting spices, getting that diversity, having nutrient-dense smoothies when applicable, and when we're feeling kind of fatigued, we need a little bit more bolstering where we need to increase nutrient density. Drinking tea throughout the day. A lot of cultures that connect to longevity do drink tea. So green tea, black tea, shaking it up, all different kinds of tea, herbal tea for people that don't want caffeine. And this is something that I put together a little while ago to really show the rainbow, that the rainbow doesn't have to just be with fruits and vegetables. It can be found with tea as well. The timing of meals, eating seasonally, being attentive to when we eat rather than just what we eat. So the when and the time, the chrononutrition, this is a piece. And combining foods for synergy. So having some citrus within our green tea to potentiate those catechins. We know that turmeric works really well with black pepper. Those two are like a duo. And then chopping a garlic clove, letting it sit for 5 minutes and potentiate a lot of those sulfur containing detoxification compounds. So there are all these different things that we can be letting our communities know about. And really at the end of the day, it is about community. The more that we can surround ourselves with people who are open and receptive to the diversity of the foods that we're eating, that they support each other in their eating habits. I think this is one of the factors that really promotes long-term lifestyle change, that your tribe needs to fit your vibe, right? And sometimes you can create the vibe in your tribe by being that source of inspiration. So there is that too. This is a powerful connection. And so this is why I tend to veer more towards doing group classes, having groups rather than more one-on-ones, because I do think that the group supports the group heals the group. So I'm going to leave you with a quote. And I saw this statement in a grocery store in Sydney, Australia. It was above the produce section, and it said, "Don't eat vegetables because they are good for you. Eat them for one reason alone, because they are gorgeous." And truly they are art. They're nature's art. So eating the rainbow makes for an inner rainbow. When we eat colorful foods, we have colorful moods. Lots of different things to take away from this, right? And if I was here with you in person, I'd be asking you what your takeaways are. I won't belabor and tell you what you need to know. I think you probably know what you need to absorb from all of this information. So I leave it in your good hands. I want to thank you for your time and attention. Really appreciate you being here and connected to the American Nutrition Association. Thanks so much. We hope you enjoyed this webinar. If you are a practitioner interested in a deeper dive in personalized nutrition, the ANA is excited to announce the launch of the Personalized Nutrition Practitioner Training Program. This educational program, designed for healthcare practitioners, provides the skills and knowledge to apply personalized nutrition into healthcare practices. Created with the latest information, assessments, modalities, and practitioner resources, this program will equip trainees with a personalized nutrition care plan for a specific patient or client.